This week, Yellow Key BitLocker bypass update, secure boot certificates are expiring, and what it actually means. The Verizon DBIR for 2026, Open Petya project, F5 Sonic Wall, and edge routers are under attack. Stay tuned. Below the surface, coming up next. Welcome to Below the Surface. It's episode number 75. We are recording on May 28th, 2026. I'm Paul Asadorian, joined by Mr. Chase Snyder. Chase, welcome.
What's up, Paul? Always
Good
pumped to
see you,
be
my
here.
friend. Mr. Vlad Babkin is here. Vlad, welcome.
Hello.
Super excited to get started. Before we do, Below the Surface listeners can learn more about Eclipsium by visiting eclipsium.com/go. You can find the ultimate guide to supply chain security. You can also find an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. If you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can sign up for a demo. All that at eclipsium.com/go. We got some awesome stories to talk about this week. I am super excited. You want to start with Verizon DBIR because that was a new latest edition, and we'll warm people up to talk about the secure boot thing because there's so many articles published about Microsoft certificates expiring, and I think 98% of them leave out a whole ton of details that ourselves and our rest of the team here at Eclipsium can provide details on. So you'll get those details in this episode, which is amazing.
But kind of our wheelhouse.
Yeah. Now that I've teased that out, let's talk about the Verizon DBIR before we jump into
Yeah, man, let's get into it. It's my favorite big deranged PDF that comes out every year. If you like reading 100+ pages PDFs, this one is for you. Always has really funny. Pages? This one's like 120. Usually hovers around 100, getting longer. Lots of good visuals, though. They know how to break up the text, and it's full of like little inside jokes and stuff. I would assume that many listeners of this podcast also get excited for Verizon DBIR release day like I do, but who knows? But the big last year, so I've across my long and storied career in cybersecurity, I've developed a habit of writing a blog post where I call out my 3 favorite things from the DBIR report every year. And last year and this year, there was a big development. Last year, it was like exploitation of vulnerabilities as an activity or as an action that was a part of the breaches that they analyzed for the report had caught up with credential abuse. So they were like, exploitation of vulnerabilities was on the way up, credential abuse was a little bit on the way down, and they were like almost at the same, frequency at that moment. And this year, exploitation of vulnerabilities is way, way higher than credential abuse. And that's a crazy trend. And I think
it's a crazy trend. I mean,
yeah,
I think the overall trend that we're seeing in covering stories on both podcasts that I do almost every week, the general consensus is that AI is shifting this vulnerability landscape.
Yeah, there's a couple things.
Attackers and security researchers have these amazing tools that can be tuned to find and exploit vulnerabilities. And we've talked about examples on this show, so I don't want to necessarily go into all the details of it. Like to me, it's an established fact, and we're seeing evidence of that in things like the Verizon DBIR, right?
Yeah.
I think that the more interesting angle to that is what do we do as defenders? And I'm kind of, you guys saw my relatively new role here at Eclipsium, providing direction for one of our research and engineering teams. And I'm kind of like, defense is the new sexy now. I mean, not taking anything away from security research. I still do that. I still think it's fun, and a lot of respect to those that do. But it's a harder problem to now, how do we get our vulnerability management and visibility and remediation better using maybe the same or similar tools that are used in offense? How do we apply that to defense? How do we get smarter at detecting these attacks, detecting these vulnerabilities? And that's, to me, the new sexy. Defense is the new sexy. I think that's been a thing we've talked about, but I think now is the time to really push that defense is the new sexy.
I think so. Something that is missing, or something that will have to happen for that to actually work, is to figure out what you can monitor or display that indicates that you as a security person or that your security tool did something. I think that something that worked out really well for the big security categories
Yeah.
that have, skyrocketed in the past decade or so, like EDR, is that they're based on an event that's super easy to report on and put on a dashboard, which is a detection and a response. And if you're moving towards a preventive model and sort of a something that's more like attack surface management or preemptive, prevention of attacks, it's way harder to say this attack didn't happen to us because we did this work ahead of time
It's harder to
versus,
prove the value. Agreed.
yeah, it's way harder to make it sexy in that way. And I think that's going to be a really key, and that's a product management and that's sort of a human factor, right? Is how can you make it reportable in a way that is appealing both to the individuals that have to do the work and also to the executives that they have to report up to be like, look at this measurable positive impact that my thing made. But I do think that organizations are getting tired of like vulnerability management. It's like, here's a skajillion vulnerabilities. Who knows if they're reachable? It's highly reportable. It's like we found all these vulnerabilities, but they are starting to recognize like most of that is like not that useful. And like alert fatigue is a cliche at this point where it's like, oh, they get it that the reportability is actually becoming kind of an overwhelming problem. But one other tidbit I want to call out from the DBIR report, though, the other thing that's highly relevant to us, the thing that we talk about all the time, network asset breaches. Network assets being targeted went up enormously. And similarly to sort of exploitation of vulns go up, credential abuse go down, network asset targeting is going up, and user targeting is going down, user device targeting. So user device went down like 60% from where it was at before or something like that. I don't know. I can't do math.
Yeah.
Double
We
digit
have more and
percent.
more data that backs up what we've been saying about the threat
Yeah.
landscape recently. So
Yeah.
which is
The
great.
number of breaches that they investigated for this report that had a network asset breach specifically as part of the flow um, went up almost 3x, more than 3x actually, more than 300% itself. It's still a
So
comparatively low number at like 5% of the total breaches, but the growth trajectory is pretty bad.
yeah. So
I'll well,
go ahead, Vlad.
I'll probably tell maybe a controversial opinion, but I don't think that this growth is only due to AI. Like this is a spike in 2023 for this growth, which is a little bit too early for anything relevant from AI. And then in 2025 it started growing while we know that AI really became useful in 2026, not 2025. So I think that part of this growth can be also attributed due to attackers getting better tools in general, not just better AI models. Like if you look at stuff like nuclei templates, which didn't exist like a couple of years ago en masse, or for example, like better and better polished tools for like Sliver, which is an like open source C2 implant, right? So they do advance defense side of things because now we can actually see an open source implant and make at least some assumptions and some guesses at how an in the wild implant might look like. So it's not like a jab against let's remove those tools. No, these tools should exist. But also it's making it easier for attackers to actually just start exploiting stuff. And the shift here is that like it's no longer enough to just hunt vulnerabilities. So what you should be doing is preventative measures, like those which are really hard to report. And that's the problem. So nobody really wants to do them because they don't provide immediate value and require your time and effort to actually implement. But at the same time, if you don't do them, your product becomes like a Swiss cheese vulnerabilities eventually. And that happens very quickly, as we see with like a lot of more legacy network devices. Like they were never designed with preventative measures in place, and they just patch holes every single week or stuff like this. And the AI will only accelerate them becoming a Swiss cheese. And it's not just like your hardware, it's also your software. So it's not like hardware vendors are singled out. It's literally every piece of software is facing this right now.
Yeah, I also think there's a lot of false negatives in vulnerability management and asset management today. Because everyone always says in
Yeah.
cybersecurity, you got to know what you have. And so when something's vulnerable, you can go determine if you've got that vulnerable thing. Now, what I've been observing in the threat landscape, maybe I'm looking harder for it, but I'm observing things that I believe traditional VM and asset management is going to miss because they're relying on a version number. And Vlad, you and I have had these conversations a lot, right? But there's been a few very specific cases of vulnerabilities. One was with F5 and one was with Arista, both network edge devices. And what happens is the vendor says, this is a critical vulnerability. So if you have it in your network, you need to pay attention to it. Let's put aside the fact that attackers are probably doing reconnaissance and attacking your stuff even before you know about the vulnerability. But when the vulnerability comes out, you still have to go determine if you're in fact have an exposure to that. And in both cases with F5 and Arista, you had to have a specific version, but also you had to have a specific feature enabled, and you have to have a specific configuration that either makes that feature vulnerable or not vulnerable. So now, when you do vulnerability management, and I'm fairly certain that traditional VM and asset management certainly does not do this, and that is correlate between what's the version that you're running and accurately pinpointing that. Then, do you have this feature enabled or not? And then, is it configured to be vulnerable or not vulnerable? Like, do you have a mitigating control in your configuration? That's some of what the team here at Eclipsium is working on when we find these specific things. I'm pretty sure there's not a lot on the market that really truly helps you with that and automate that discovery process, because that's going to shape your response as to whether or not you need to push out a patch to these things that live on the edge that could carry some operational risk with it. And just relying on a version number is certainly, in my mind, not enough. I also think we have the same problem with copy fail and dirty frag and all of those vulnerabilities. If you're relying on just the kernel version, well, that could lead to a false positive or false negative. Whoever is making that Linux distribution, right? Because Linux runs on all these network edge devices and all the devices in general. They could have said that they fixed it, right? They could have a version number that said it's fixed. However, in their custom Linux distro, they never took on the patch to actually remediate the vulnerability because everyone's loosey-goosey with their kernel version numbers. So if your checker asset or VM is just relying on a kernel version, did you actually check that that kernel took the patch to remediate that vulnerability? And that's some of the other things that I'm researching is how do we do that? Because these checks have to be
It's
today.
it gets even better. Like if you look at all of the, oh hey, your container image contains a ton of CVEs. Well, if you analyze like the 400 CVs that you have, 399 of them are actually completely irrelevant because they're like in disk partitioning tools. How often do your container runs disk partitioning tools at all? Like it takes a lot of effort to actually try to clean those containers up. It sucks out a lot of money to just comply with the requirements to have zero CV container without bringing any tangible benefit whatsoever.
Right.
And like yeah, we know that it doesn't have a vulnerability in partitioning image, but did it improve your security posture? No, because it didn't add any preventative measures to your web application. And the actual initial attack vector, which is usually just your stupid code injection bug in somewhere in the web app or like shell injection, something like this, is still present because you never fixed it. And better yet, your router still has all of the CVEs inside of it. So like you eliminated them in your container, but not everywhere else in your infrastructure because there is no requirement to do this and because there is no device which does this. So all of these measures should be just reevaluated and potentially just removed from compliance requirements because like it's just sucking away time and money from companies
Yeah. I mean,
instead of
that
like
being
letting
said,
them focus on something that's useful.
if you're building an application on Docker containers, I highly recommend the containers that are already pre-hardened, and you can get those for free from multiple sources. I forget where I got mine for one of my projects, but they're free, Docker images, and they come with as few CVEs as possible, right? And that's just, to me, that's good practice. It's easy. It doesn't cause me any pain. If you get it from a good source that's actually paying attention to CVEs and fixing it, that's a good thing. But like you said, Vlad, then you've got the application level problem. And that is, if it's a Python application like I have on Docker, what libraries am I relying on and how am I managing those dependencies? And that's a double-edged sword, because I could say, well, always build with the latest version of that library, which one, I have to fix the things that breaks in my application, which sometimes it does. Also, the latest version could be the one that's poisoned, right? And
Yep.
the older version is not poisoned. So I'm not really protecting against a supply chain attack by, bouncing around between versions. I could bounce back to a vulnerable or backdoored version, or vice versa. I could jump forward, and that's
Yep.
the one that actually was hit with a supply chain attack.
And better yet, like not all of the vulnerabilities in the library is even relevant.
Yeah,
So
and
like
does
for
here's the
example,
thing. Yeah, does my
like
code even use the part of that library that contains the vulnerability, right? That's where you're
yeah,
I forget what the category of tool, but there's tools that will tell you that in source code
yep.
analysis.
Yep, and but better yet as well. Like if you look at like how you structure your API, potentially if even if you're using vulnerable part of the library, because of your API input controls, you might not be getting
Yeah,
attacked from this
right,
vulnerability. Like
right.
for example, let's say limiting passwords to 32 characters will eliminate most bcrypt library related bugs for like hashing. Yeah, it's not a good practice to limit password lengths, but if the password length limit is high enough, like 30, 40 characters, that's fine. But it eliminates the whole concern of like what happens when you put more than 64 characters. Bcrypt doesn't like those inputs usually, and like you just eliminated the whole concern. It no longer care about this. So there might even be mitigating controls even for like core cryptographic stuff where this might happen. Or like in this case, also like 99% of attacks come from anything that's exposed to the outside, and that's actually a minority of libraries and even minority of your own internal source
Right,
code.
right.
Like, okay, your function somewhere deep within the source code is vulnerable, but is this even reachable? And that's really hard question. Like, AI companies are trying to come up with ways to answer it, but it's not gonna be like give us deterministic answers. Like AI is probabilistic. While it can help uncover vulnerabilities, it will not lead you to 100% coverage.
No.
So you cannot just rely on AI to replace your cybersecurity program. It's a tool, not really a replacement for it.
Yeah, 100%.
So you
Um,
need controls. You need much better API validations and whatnot. It's
yeah,
not it's not just slap AI on it and it's solved.
yeah.
Like
I
even if
think
you put AI on it, it's still a
it's
big
a
problem.
tool, and we've got problems that it might help and it might not. Microsoft Secure Boot certificates expiring is one such problem. I think the articles that I've read certainly don't do this justice or explain it. And so we're actually working on an article, so you get a little sneak preview to this. I talked about this last night, so I actually updated one of my tools in my personal GitHub. That's a supply chain checker tool that's based on the Eclipsium Linux supply chain cheat sheet that I created, and I added some functionality to it to analyze the secure boot certificates as a general term, and see if you have one that's about to expire. And so, what many will talk about is they're like, a Microsoft certificate is expiring, which is technically not correct. There's actually three certificates expiring this year. One is the big one that a lot of people are talking about. That one expires in about a month on June 27th. The Microsoft Corporation KEC CA 2011, that's your key exchange key, is expiring in about a month. What that does is it authorizes DB and DBX updates, so your allow list and your revocation list, and allows Windows to push that via Windows Update. So that one's expiring. You have to make sure that, from what I understand, Vlad, is you can have both the 2011 and the 2023 Microsoft cat key on your system, but as long as you have the 2023 one in there, you're good, because the 2011 one's still going to validate older entries. In the newer one is for the newer entries. So if you have both, it's not a problem. It's only if you have the 2011 and not the 2023, correct?
Yes, I think it is that way. So I never quite validated this in depth, but like from what I understood as per how secure boot works, it is this. And also like what I have seen with Linux, you sometimes even have your own custom keys and you just sign your own drivers. So in this case, you also don't quite care, right? If you already like use that kind of system. But in general, it is this. If you have like both keys installed, you're good.
Yeah, and now the other two keys or certificates that are expiring are in the DB. So your DB and DBX can contain certificates or hashes that are, for lack of a better term, representative of software that it's been signed to be allowed to boot and secure boot or not, right? They've been revoked via the DBX. And the big one for Linux users, especially, is the Microsoft Corporation UEFI CA 2011 is the certificate that signs Linux shim third-party option ROMs and non-Windows bootloaders. So if you're running Linux, you're affected by these Microsoft certs expiring, which we've talked about, in the past a lot, and a lot of people in the Linux community were upset from day one when that happened. But what Microsoft is doing is they're actually splitting that certificate into two different certificates. So one certificate will do OS bootloaders, and the other one will do hardware option ROMs. And I think they're doing that for like compatibility reasons. If they ever need to revoke this cert or change it or expire it, they can treat the option ROMs for hardware separate from the OS bootloaders, like Linux shim or other third-party bootloaders. So it's not a bad move by Microsoft to split these out. It splits up the functionality. Um, and of course, your option ROMs are if you have a piece of hardware in your system and UEFI goes, "Well, I don't quite know how to initialize or load this hardware." The hardware can go, "Oh, here's a piece of code in the form of an option ROM that should be signed, that gives UEFI instructions on how to initialize and load that hardware." There was a Black Hat talk 2 years ago that talked about how to abuse option ROMs to gain code execution in UEFI, which was interesting. So you can go look that up. That was a good one. And there's other weird things with option ROMs. If you can find, I think the use case really is you find an option ROM that has a vulnerability that's been signed, right? That hasn't been revoked. That gives you code execution, basically. I want to say also, this is the scenarios that lead to gamers that want and to bypass anti-cheat. They put hardware in their systems that uses an option ROM bypass is my theory. I've heard some stuff about that as well. Vlad, I don't know if you've looked at any of that. No one really
So
talks about
I didn't look at like how hardware cheats work per se, but it's definitely a hardware device which somehow needs to be validated with secure boot certificate. So obviously, like nobody is gonna issue like a signature for obviously cheating device, like it's gonna raise a lot of questions. And those actually often require DMA access to like random memory regions,
Right.
which let's just say it's questionable. But the biggest question is if you can actually put your own key in the system, you don't even care about bypassing anything because now you have your own secure boot key,
Right.
right? So, like in this case, I think it's a mixture of approaches most likely. And again, this is just to make it harder to detect.
Yep.
And yeah, like there was a recent noise about like Valorant requiring you to enable IOMMU, which was like a lot of noise. In my opinion, that's actually pretty darn funny. But in this case, like Valorant claims were questionable when they started claiming that breaking hardware is great, and they got a lot of backlash for that. To be honest, deserved. Like you shouldn't market that way. But I don't think that enabling IOMMU is gonna break any legitimate hardware, at least that I know of.
Right. The third certificate is the Microsoft's Windows Production PCA 2011 certificate. That's expiring in October of 2026. That's the one that signs the Windows bootloaders, and that will get an update to a Windows UEFI CA 2023 for the Windows bootloaders. So those are the three certificates. Now they live in different places, right? The first one, the key exchange key, lives in the KEK variable, and the others are in the DB. And so it's I think the articles have also done a bad job of kind of describing like what threats that this could allow. And also not necessarily calling out that your DBX update specifically is independent almost of your KEK update. In other words, you could update to the new, you could put the new Microsoft key exchange key in the key exchange key variable, but your DBX has not been updated. That still leaves you vulnerable to bootkits. So these are things that have to be done together. You need a way to check for, do I have systems that are running the 2011, that have the 2011 certs or certs that are expiring? And then the other check is, do I have the latest DBX update on those systems? And both those things have to be done.
It gets a little bit more fun also if you start to consider some really old hardware, like stuff that was signed with 2011 key is not guaranteed to have been resigned with 2023 key. So
Right.
when you actually do this update, you need to leave yourself an emergency hatch that, oh, hey, you just put a new key in there and suddenly it just stopped booting because hardware is no longer trusted. Great.
Yep.
You just shoot yourself in the leg. So when you do this update, it's very important not to break your own device and like allow yourself at least some wiggle room to actually boot it with the old key or boot it without secure boot or do something at least in case this happens to you. So that like you have at least the option to pretty much just emergency sign, issue yourself a local key and sign using that.
Right. Yeah, and that's particularly important with bootloaders too. I've seen a lot of user forum threads. So in some software stops you from doing this, but basically, if you're applying an update to your DBX to your revocation list, and your existing bootloader is in that revocation list, that means when you reboot, secure boot is not going to load your bootloader, which is a bad day, unless you can get in your BIOS and disable secure boot. So a lot of tools that do that will actually stop that workflow from happening, so you don't shoot yourself in the foot in that way. But I think that's the point, right? Is updating these things could lead to scenarios where systems don't boot if you're not careful in applying all of these updates. So I would treat this like many other security controls or patches where you're doing controlled rollouts. So you're not rolling out new certificates or DBX updates to 100,000 workstations at once. You're doing this in phases and stages in monitoring.
Yep. Yeah, if you have a large enough enterprise, I hope you're already doing this for like half a year by now and not just started because we told about it today, right? Because like you need a good chunk of time to actually validate everything. And like give some wiggle room for yourself to actually fix issues, because like if you update 100,000 machines and 10,000 of them just die and you have this all in one day, your poor IT team is gonna kill you.
Right. Cool.
So
And we have a whole article coming out about this to help people understand and manage this in their various environments, as well as some of our own product capabilities to help you out that identifies these expiring certs on your systems, which is super important. And like Vlad said, you should already been doing this. If not, you're going to be in a vulnerable state until you get it sorted out.
Yeah, if the best state to be is to have been doing this for a while. The next state, the next best is to literally start planning this today, and like start at the very least checking what's up with your environment if you didn't start yet. Because like if you wait for longer, you will have nasty surprises.
Yeah,
which is
Start
like
with
Windows is gonna.
Sorry, I was going to say start with the key exchange key because that's the one that's expiring soon. The other ones in the DB aren't till October. I think that's Oh no, I'm sorry. There's one in the DB. The third party Linux one is June 27. The one that signs the Microsoft bootloader is October 2026. All that'll be in the
Yep.
blog post. So
Yeah, and then like it gets better because when Microsoft starts rolling out Windows updates which are not signed with the old key, your systems will be left without updates.
right,
So either that or they will update and not boot afterwards.
right,
So
right. There's a lot to secure boot, all these certificates and the whole process. So I hope when this article comes out, it clears the air. I read a couple other articles that I flagged, one or two that actually got it right and went into all the details. I didn't add that to the show notes, but I've been needing to put that in the resources for this post because there are a couple of good ones out there. So, what else do we have to talk about? But what do you think of this Open Petya project?
well, for me, like I don't know like how much we told viewers about where I'm from, but I'm from Ukraine, so I have seen NotPetya with my own two eyes. So like I have like not PTSD, but like I remember what went down in Ukraine with NotPetya and how fun that was. So for me, it's like extra fun to see an open version of this malware to try to construct something similar, just for research purposes this time and not for evil, which is super interesting. And like I would be very interested in actually digging in once I get at least a little bit of time to look at this.
Yeah, it's interesting. They do something with the master boot record booting, but that's like wicked old school, and I'm curious as to why they're doing something in the master boot record. And they have it in this an assembly program, and I haven't like gone through it. I'm not sure that works to boot on modern systems.
That's actually a good question. So
That was one
I
thing
think
where I was like,
yeah, they were targeting Windows 7 and apparently they were inspired by NotPetya and Petya, which I think both had master boot record things in them.
okay, I gotcha.
Like if my memory serves me right. Plus also I presume this is some students project or
It is,
maybe if not even if not students, it's at least some researcher who wants to learn stuff.
yeah.
And starting with master boot records, think this probably is a good way to actually start it because that's historic. And with technology, it's very interesting to actually go in the historic route.
Mm,
Like, for example, if you have time to allocate and you want to learn Python for reals, start with Python 2.7, even though it's dead,
mm-hmm,
because it's going to give you a lot of historic perspective which you wouldn't ever have otherwise.
right.
And like, for example, it's same with JavaScript. Don't start with a framework, start with raw JavaScript, and
Mm-hmm,
ideally with like slightly older browsers. Because if you do that, no matter what frameworks comes out, it will take you maybe 2-3 weeks to adapt, not years, because you know how it works underneath. So same here. This is pretty interesting. So if it is a student project made for learning, this makes perfect sense to me.
yeah, and that's what it looked like. I wanted to call it out as that as well, and not in a bad way.
Yeah, it's not bad, just perspective.
The updates to Yellow Key. I don't remember what we disclosed on the last show about Yellow Key. We do have a blog post about it,
Yeah.
and like the details were emerging as we were writing that post,
Mm,
and new details have emerged. I do want to call out that there was a misunderstanding about the BIOS password of the protection mechanism for that, and that's what we're calling the administrator password. The problem is everyone calls it something different. That's what prevents you from getting into your BIOS, right? There's a credential password before you can get into your BIOS. That doesn't actually mitigate the yellow key attack because the yellow key attack preys upon WinRE, Windows Recovery Environment, and you don't need to change the boot order in order to do that. So I'm not sure why or how this BIOS password. Maybe they're getting it confused with the called a startup or storage password, which means before your system will boot, you enter a password.
mm.
But again, operationally, that's super hard to implement. Um, The other thing about Yellow Key that I thought was interesting is that there is a 404 in our blog post right now. I'm not sure if we've gone back and updated it yet.
Yeah, we put a little editorial note in there.
We did put a note in there because the original author's GitHub account was yanked. And so I guess this is what happens when you piss off Microsoft. They go, oh, you have a GitHub account. Guess what? We own GitHub. So we're just going to fuck your GitHub account because you're distributing stuff that they feel shouldn't be distributed due to disclosure. And there was a whole disclosure mess with this, which is how it was put out there in the first place. My understanding is the author then went to GitLab, but then his GitLab account was yanked as well, which is not owned by Microsoft, but still they pulled it. So I don't know if you haven't cloned the repository by now. I don't know where it lives currently, which is interesting.
So, like, Microsoft, you're not handling this right. Just calling out on podcast. If somebody from Microsoft is handling this, where do you think Nightmare Eclipse will go next? He is not gonna start communicating with you, especially considering you pissed him off.
Right.
He is probably gonna sell this, and probably to much worse people than just putting it on GitLab, on GitHub. But now you will have no visibility into what he just sold. And apparently he has a whole stash of stuff. And I doubt you will like to find out that it has been sold to China later down the line, which can happen. Like, I'm not trying to threaten you. I'm just like, logical conclusion. Where do you go next? It's not going to be Microsoft. So that's not the way
Evan
to
from
handle this.
Desired Effect on the podcast before. We note that there is in fact a anonymous brokered marketplace for buyers and sellers of of such research. And yeah, you ideally want it
There's very
to get into
legitimate places. You're right, Chase. There's very legitimate places to sell exploits or malicious tradecraft, if you will. And you're right, Vlad. This is Microsoft is just forcing the researcher's hand to go down those other paths, right? I mean, as a path, responsible disclosure, coordinated disclosure. You know, we've talked about those over the years, certainly. But this is a case where it's not a good situation for anyone.
And like, most independent researchers right now are looking at Microsoft and like, okay, should they report to them or should they go straight to the black market? And I would say if I would be an independent researcher and I had some Microsoft related stuff and I have seen the whole story of Nightmare Eclipse, and I would have if I'm a researcher and worth my piece of salt, I would probably not go to Microsoft right now. Like corporate guys like us, like, we can go through the company. It's a little bit harder to mess with a specific dude. But independent researchers, they probably have a pretty good question if they even should disclose something to Microsoft.
Right. I'm sure independent researchers can also use US CERT. I don't know if it carries as much weight as a company. I don't know if I don't want to say that they have biases like that, if that's not true. But I really like working with CERT CC or US CERT, and you create a Vince ticket, and US CERT helps you. So I think we might have talked about this a little bit when we talked about the KVM disclosure. US CERT will pull in all the responsible parties and kind of broker that discussion. I like that process personally, and I mean I've only done it a couple times. I'm sure some people have done it, maybe had a bad experience. I mean, I hope not, but my experiences have been very positive using US CERT in the Vince system. You get a chat, everyone can communicate, and folks from US CERT actually help both parties kind of get on the same page and sort it all out. And so that's one thing, but obviously that doesn't always work for every scenario. I don't know if independent researchers know that exists. And like I said, I don't know if we just have a better time with it because we've got accounts in the system as a company. Maybe that carries more weight. I don't know. That's just speculation.
You mentioned bug bounty programs, and that makes me I'm interested in how the current technology landscape is going to change how bug bounties work. I think already some companies are getting rid of their bug bounty programs because AI fundamentally makes it just untenable for them to offer any sort of like the volume and the ease of discovery of the kinds of bugs. They would either have to create way more restrictive rules around it or diminish the rewards. It would just have to be a totally different program in the current landscape with what AI research enables.
Hopefully bug bounties will evolve with time. One of the big indicators for me is my good friend Casey Ellis, kind of stepped down from bug crowd.
Hmm.
To me, that was telling. I don't think Casey or folks in that position would ever come out and say, "Oh, bug bounties are dead," right? I mean, he was still on the board and stuff like that. And I
Sure.
don't think bug bounties are dead. I'm sure some
No.
people are going to declare them dead. I think you're right, Chase. I think it's got to morph and change. I think there's still value in having a bug bounty program. However, I think in my opinion, those programs will be more highly specialized, more along the lines of invite only, and kind of like your mass discovery of vulnerabilities in your properties that you own will be discovered by AI. And so, if it's my company, I'm gonna be like, well, we're gonna spend this much on AI and find our own bugs. And we're gonna, bug bounty programs are gonna be a different beast and be more specialized, if you will.
Yeah, it'll have to, as with many things in this rapidly developing technology landscape. God, I sound like an AI in the current times, in these uncertain times. But this reminds me of something that we didn't quite touch on the Verizon DBIR report outputs that was related to the volume of vulnerabilities and the uh, pace of patching. And something that just really stuck out to me was they compared all their data going all the way back to I think like 2020, and they noted that for a while patching timelines were on a positive trajectory where teams were getting their patches out, you know, within 7 days or within, there was like it was getting better. Critical vulnerabilities or vulnerabilities that were on the kev were getting patched faster and faster. And then that peaked in 2024 and then has gotten substantially worse since then. And now from this report, they said that only 26% of critical vulnerabilities, so that's ones on the kev, were fully remediated by organizations in 2025, a drop from the previous year's 38%. So the ones that got remediated fully at all went down 12% over the past year. And the median time for resolution went up to 43 days from 32 days. So it's taking longer and they're getting less of them actually done over time. And part of that is due to just the sheer volume. The other stat, and then I'll stop spewing stats, was that the instances of vulnerabilities in the DBIR data set. So it's not different vulnerabilities. Like they look at a bunch of breaches, like more than 30,000, I think, in this one. And the number of different vulnerabilities that were represented across all of those, or the number of vulnerabilities overall, but some of them could be the same across different breaches, went up from 68.7 million in 2022 to 527 million in 2025. So like in 3 years, the number like 9x'd or something of like instances of vulnerabilities. So that jives really well with increase in exploitation of vulnerabilities as an attack activity that's happening. But just it's a totally unsustainable volume. Of course, companies can't patch those. But as we were talking about prevention and preemptive defense versus detection and response, and they talk about the gap between patching and exploitation in the report. And right now, in this current report, only 12% of vulnerabilities were remediated before being added to the kev, which means that the majority of vulnerabilities don't get patched until they're already known to be exploited, and it's getting worse. Went down from 17% in 2024. So, just every stat that you can look at about the pace of patching and the number of vulnerabilities and the number of critical known exploited vulnerabilities and how many are getting patched at all or not, and how long it's taking. It's getting worse on every front, and I think it's going to have to lead to a total transformation in how we approach that kind of uh,
And so it's
defense.
funny, we have three examples of this, you know, threat landscape trend that's happening. One is gray noise has observed that once CVE 2026-0400 came out, which is a vulnerability in SonicWall, that was preceded by scanning. And so that's backing up a couple of different points, right? One, network edge devices still are the target. Number two, they either know about the vulnerability before it's disclosed and patched, or they're just pre-scanning the internet knowing that someone's going to find and disclose a vulnerability, or maybe they've already got an exploit for it. Maybe someone found a vulnerability, did not disclose it to SonicWall. They used it to exploit a SonicWall device. Someone did forensics and go, hey, that's a new thing. Like, there must be a vulnerability here. And they report it to SonicWall, and they go fix it. I think the point is you're already owned. And that's scary today. That this is I think the shift that's happened, that we can point to several different pieces of evidence, and this great, Gray Noise is doing great work in pointing this out. So
yeah, they got a shout out in the DBIR. Shout out Gray Noise, good work. They became referenced in the report. I think for that, I don't remember exactly what was quoted, but I assume it was that. They're reporting on the ability to detect scanning in advance of the exploitation of a previously undisclosed vulnerability.
yeah, and what do you do if there's no patch? I mean, the recommendation from Gray Noise is to harden your devices, right? And that's one thing, but again, we come back to that lack of visibility on these platforms.
Yeah, it's like the amount of friction that you have to introduce into your own environment to have, really effective segmentation or micro segmentation and access controls that can, introduce friction for the attacker or completely eliminate their ability. Any of that stuff that you do adds friction for your own teams as well. And it's really hard to strike that balance when there's a specter of unknown vulnerabilities out there.
Prevention, but no matter how much prevention we try and put in place, someone's still going to get in. And so then we need detection. And that's where a lack of visibility is killing us on these network edge devices. Is how do I go in and discover when there's something that's compromised my SonicWall device, right?
Yeah.
We're putting a lot of efforts here in Eclipsium to help on various platforms. The problem is there's a lot of platforms, and as Vlad certainly well knows, each one of those platforms is its own unique snowflake. Not only that, each product line has different ways the product can be deployed across different versions. It can be virtual, it can be physical, it can be part of some hypervisor system. It's that version runs this way, this version runs another way. I think we talked about ASA and the long history behind it, right? There's a lot of different things. Like, this version behaves this way. This version has an API, but now that API is deprecated in later versions. So navigating this, trying to give folks visibility into these devices is a huge challenge.
Yeah, 100%.
In full force, but
yeah, this was like the central topic of this keynote that the global CISO of JP Morgan Chase gave at RSA, this most recent RSA. So it was Pat Opet. We've talked about him before probably, but he talked about the network vulnerability of network devices. And he said in the presentation, which is on YouTube, we can, share a link to it. He said in the presentation that they are now proactively reaching out to their device vendors twice a day to tell them about a vulnerability that they, need them to fix. So that's, it's like, who's doing the threat research? It's the JP Morgan is calling up the network vendors like, hey, you got to fix this. But yeah, he said the devices we put on the edge of our network to separate us and create trust between the untrusted internet and an enterprise ecosystem, the very devices that are supposed to be our frontline defense, so that indicates firewall to me, are becoming our greatest weakness. And he also said something very much about the sort of speed. He used this awesome phrase, mean time to adapt. And he said, I would argue that the mean time to adapt those devices is on a potentially decade scale versus the speed of the attacker, which is on a daily scale, which I guess when he says a potentially decade scale, it's not about them patching the devices. It's like they're getting these network boxes that you can't instrument with a, EDR agent or whatever. They're getting these from the vendors. And if you were to look inside of it, the level of old and busted, outdated underlying Linux and firmware and miscellaneous stuff in there. It's an archaeological dig inside of these black box network devices.
And every Linux is its own custom snowflake too, which makes it extremely difficult to have great visibility when it's Linux, but you don't have this capability, you don't have that capability, and is this library here, is that here, what's supported. So F5 was also the latest in the target. It was the latest target of campaigns. The article I have here says threat actors are exploiting end-of-life F5 big IP appliances to gain unauthorized SSH access, using that to pivot into the Active Directory infrastructure, which we've talked about. Many different network edge appliance vendors being used in this way. This article is pretty good. There's also a link to Microsoft's analysis of this campaign as well. We get a lot of details here. We get some IOCs, or IOCs, as people like to say. But really file hashes and stuff like that. I haven't checked to see if these hashes are on VirusTotal, but I really want to have better information sharing around this. I want the malware samples, right? Why are we just sharing the indicators, which is great, but can we also share the samples? Because that'd be super helpful too. And it would allow people to build better defenses to combat this malware. And F5 is just, the latest example. In this one, though, it's going after end of life appliances, which, we talk about how attackers are going after stuff with O-Day, but also end of life is a perfectly fine target because you can't patch it. So they're going after those as well. So read the Microsoft article. That's the most comprehensive one on this topic. I also had one. I don't know which routers this campaign is targeting. And the link to the research is a super weird site that I've never seen before. It's a company called Kita, QIITA. Identified the intrusion and noted the campaign reflects a clear strategic decision to target network infrastructure rather than individual computers, which is something we just talked about. They tie it back to China, and they give a bunch of IOCs in the report as well. The malware that they analyzed is for Linux x86-64. So I don't know what routers they're targeting that are x86 based. Typically they're ARM, but this one is not, which is interesting. Yeah, and they do provide some indicators about this specific malware. But no, I couldn't figure out in here exactly which routers they were going after. They didn't state.
Yeah.
So it's like we're always missing information. When we want information about a threat in IOCs, we seem to always be missing something. Like, can't we just share all the things? I don't get it.
Yeah, I understand also, like, if you don't want to share them widely, but at the very least, like, there are companies like us who try to do defense against it, and we are well known. So it's known that we're not going to just publish this if you don't want it.
Right.
So
Or
the
use
question
it
is,
maliciously, right? Maybe that's why they don't want to share the malware, because they don't want other people using it maliciously, which I get. But yeah, there needs to be, you're right, a better way to share without being public.
Yep. If somebody knows of this way, just contact us. We promise we'll not
contact
tell on
us.
podcast.
Yeah. I haven't like started reaching out to my network and asking people how we do this, but I will, and then I won't be able to share any details on the show about how we're getting malware samples, but there's that. So yeah, more can be. I mean, this is just evidence that is tracking with what we've been saying about the threat landscape. So, and some cool stuff to go read as well. Anything else we want to talk about this week? We covered a lot of ground. I thought we were actually going to be pressed for time.
Really went places.
We ended on certainly not a positive note, but we ended within the time marker. I want to thank Chase and Vlad for appearing on the show today. Thank everyone for listening and watching this edition of Below the Surface. That'll conclude the show. We'll see you next time.